All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Genesis class. Last week, I started talking about the offering up of Isaac, and it didn't quite get all the way through. So I'd like to pick up where I left off there. I mentioned about, what an incredible demand this was of God on Abraham. And when you read the account, it's so brief, it doesn't give you a lot of the background. It kind of sounds like God says, I want you to offer up your son, and Abraham says, well, okay. And I'm sure that there was a lot more to it than what we read here, but we're given the a brief set of facts, and there's probably a lot more to the story. But I was going through why might God have asked this of Abraham? And I have a hunch it's probably not any one thing. It's just a combination of things that serve God's purpose. And I want to bring something up. Gary Jones was teaching in here just before the Genesis class. He was talking about our relationship with God and really knowing God on an intimate level. And I have in my notes here that he brought this up on September 22nd. He brought this very topic up, why sacrifice Isaac? And I thought he had a very valid point that I'd remind you of. By asking Abraham to do that, he was asking, is Isaac more important than me? Or is there anything more important than me? Is there anything that stands in the way of our relationship? And I think that's a lesson for all of us. We have to ask ourselves, is there anything that we love more than God, or anything that we cannot let go of? Isaac was a child of promise. He was the result of a miracle. Isaac and his future descendants were the key to the land promise, and it all ends if Isaac dies. And so God is asking, is there anything standing in the way? Isaac could have been an idol. And so we might ask ourselves, how far will we go to reverence God? In verse 2, God emphasizes just how dear Isaac is to Abraham. He says to Abraham, he says, I want you to take your son. And then he emphasizes this, your only son. Now, he did have a son prior to this, Ishmael, but there's something special about Isaac because it was his only son through his wife Sarah, a child of promise. He says, your only son. And if that wasn't enough, he says, the one whom you love, where you have this special feeling for, whom you love. And he says, I want you to offer him there as a burnt offering. It's like God says, I know he's really special to you, but this is what I want you to do. Are you willing to even sacrifice him for the sake of our relationship? And they go off to the land of Moriah on one of the mountains. It may be an area around Jerusalem. We read that it was a 3-day journey. Someone did a little research and said that a donkey can travel about 20 miles in a day, so that means they probably could go a radius of about 60 miles. It's generally believed that this is in the area of modern-day Jerusalem, which modern-day Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, is about a 60-mile journey from Beersheba, which is where Abraham was living. And the only other mention of Mount Moriah is in 2 Chronicles 3:1, where it says, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. And it may be that this mountain could be either the Temple Mount or possibly even Golgotha itself, where the Lord was crucified. And in verse 5, we're told that there were actually 4 people that went there, Abraham and Isaac, but also 2 young men who were servants in his household. And Abraham and Isaac go out by themselves and says, we will worship and return to you. So that brings up maybe the final reason why God was asking Abraham this amazing sacrifice was that it serves as a type of Christ's sacrifice. So I've come up with a number of parallels here between Isaac and Christ. First of all, Both were born, or both were conceived miraculously. Both were conceived and born other than in natural means as a promise. And so therefore they were both son of promise. There was something special that was going to be accompanied by this son. Also, Isaac was his only son with Sarah. Here, God calls him his only son. And of course, Jesus was the only begotten son. We are sons of God, but Jesus was the only begotten son, one who was born in a fleshly means. Also, Isaac carried the wood for his sacrifice. Here, it's kind of ironic that here, the very wood that he would be sacrificed on, this is what Isaac was carrying. Likewise, Jesus carried the instrument of his death. He actually had to carry the cross himself. Likewise, Isaac was laid on top of the wood. Jesus was laid on top of the cross, nailed to the cross, and then lifted up. Also, as far as we know, Isaac was to be sacrificed on a hill in what is now Jerusalem. And of course, we know Jesus was crucified on a hill in Jerusalem. There were two young men with Abraham and Isaac. Likewise, there were two men that were crucified on either side of Jesus. When they get to the place of sacrifice, Isaac says, "My father." He exclaims this. Likewise, Jesus said, my God, my God." Isaac was marked for death, but by being spared, he got to live again. In a sense, he got a second chance on life. Likewise, Jesus was sacrificed, but he got to live again. All right. Also, we read that Isaac made a 3-day journey. Likewise, Jesus was in the grave for 3 days before he was resurrected. In the case of Isaac, there was a ram that was substituted for his life. With the Christ, he serves as the Lamb of God. He was substituted for us. And so this introduces the concept of substitution. In a sense, we even go back to the Garden of Eden, where God made animal skins for Adam and Eve. In a sense, was a form of substitution. The angel of the Lord appears to Abraham and tells him to stop what he's doing. And Genesis refers to the angel of the Lord during two incidents, and some believe this may be in a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Christ. First of all, he appears to a pregnant Hagar after she had fled from Sarai. And the words in verse 11 there echo what an angel of the Lord had said to Joseph in a dream regarding pregnant Mary, where he says, this child will be special, and gives the child a name. And then here in chapter 22, we see the angel of the Lord appearing to Abraham when he stopped him from sacrificing, which again is a type of the sacrifice of Jesus. All right, well, next we move on to chapter 23, the death of Sarah. We read that Sarah was 123 years old when she died, and she died in the city of Hebron. Verse 17, we read that Abraham bought a field which was in Machpelah, which faced Mamre. And Sarah was the first person to be buried there in that cave. And then later on in Bible history, we read that she was followed by Abraham to be buried in the cave. In fact, it was basically a family burial plot. So after her, Abraham, and then later, Isaac was buried there. His wife Rebekah was buried there. And then one of Jacob's two wives, Leah, she was buried there. And then finally, we'll read very last chapter of Genesis. We read about the death of the great Israelite patriarch Jacob, and that eventually his remains were brought back to Canaan, and he was buried in that cave. And this site remains a hallowed site for both Jews and Muslims to this day. I believe there's a mosque that is built over that cave in Hebron that stands to this day. And Sarah played an important role in God's plan. God told Eve that one of her descendants would crush the head of Satan. And through Sarah, the Messianic line continued through the miraculous birth of Isaac, and it culminated in the virgin birth of Jesus. So really, it was through Abraham and Sarah that really got things underway as far as bringing the Messiah into the world. And I like this excerpt from Adam Clark's commentary about just how important this woman was. Clark says, "It is worthy of remark that Sarah is the only woman in the sacred writings whose age, death, and burial are distinctly noted. And she has been deemed worthy of higher honor, for the Apostle Paul makes her a type of the Church of Christ. And her faith in the accomplishment of God's promise that she should have a son is particularly celebrated in Hebrews 11:11. With Sarah, the promise of the incarnation of Christ is commenced, and with Mary, it is terminated, having had its exact completion. Thus, God put more honor upon these two women, that is, Sarah and Mary, than upon all the daughters of Eve besides." Likewise, this is a quote from Kaufman's commentary, who I've relied on quite a bit for this class. Between Answers in Genesis and Kaufman, they're both good sources. He said that the death of Sarah is the only event of a woman's death and burial to be recorded in the Bible thus far, indicating the epic importance of Sarah in the divine economy. And he goes on to point out that the New Testament references stress her status as a type of the Jerusalem which is above, and which is our mother, and which is free. Peter pointed Christian women to the example of Sarah, whose children they had become. And then finally, the author of Hebrews extolled Sarah's faith along with that of the greatest of the patriarchs. She was one of the few women to be mentioned in Hebrews 11 in that hall of fame of faith. Well, now we're moving on to the next generation about Isaac's marriage. And chapter 24 is a very long passage. There was one we looked at a few chapters ago. It was like maybe 19 verses. This one is 67 verses. And one of the major themes in chapter 24 is the gradual transfer of the promise from Abraham to Isaac. So God is kind of like handing off the baton in a sense. He's handing off to Isaac with all the associated blessings. I mean, Abraham is still there, but he's getting older, and we realize there's a new generation coming along. So, a bride for Isaac. Abraham realizes his time's running out, and he doesn't want his son to marry one of the local Canaanite women. He wants somebody who comes from a God-fearing family, from his own family, people that he can trust. Abraham sends his head servant on a mission to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. Remember, Abraham and his parents were originally from the city of Ur, and then he and his father, his brother Nahor, and Lot, they went as far as the city of Nahor and then stayed there, and then eventually Abraham moved on. But anyway, Abraham has family ties to the city of Nahor. And Nahor was the name of the surviving, actually I think I've got this wrong. I said surviving. I think actually Nahor was the name of the brother that died. I believe it was, I'm trying to remember now. It was Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Yeah. Nahor was the surviving brother. Haran was the one that died, and perhaps they named the city after him. I'm not sure. So anyway, and Nahor was Lot's father. So in verses 10 through 14, the servant devised a water test to sort out the character, attitude, and personality of the woman to be chosen. Now, I don't think God revealed this, but he said basically, God, when I go there, what I remember, he said something like, if this woman offers to water the camels and so on, if she says these words, then let that be the sign that this is the right woman for Isaac. And so in verses 15 through 61, we see that Rebekah is chosen. Beginning 15, the servant determines that Rebekah is the one that God has chosen for Isaac, and the servant acknowledges God's providence in making this possible and providing him a successful journey. And then in verse 28, we read that the servant goes to meet with the future bride's family. And then we have a very lengthy record of the conversation, word-for-word conversation that goes on there. And, it's amazing. I don't know if you ever really thought about this. Do you realize you're reading about people that lived roughly like maybe 1,800, 1,900 years before Christ. So have you ever thought about that? You're reading the actual conversation, the actual words of people that lived maybe 3,800 years ago. It's pretty amazing that we have a record preserved of that we even know about these people. But I think that's just amazing when I read that. So in verses 33, we have a record of that conversation. In the verse 50, the servant bestows valuable jewelry and clothing on the family. And Rebekah decides to go with him. She'd never met him before. It's all kind of happens very quickly. That's a huge life-changing decision. It's one thing just to get married, but to get married then move a world away, it's pretty incredible. So I want you to note the great faith and the sacrifices on the part of Rebekah. There must have been something special about her. First of all, she did not ask for more time to make up her mind. She could have said, wow, this is a big decision. Could I have about 6 months here to ponder this and look at the pros and the cons? But she didn't do that. Also, she accepted the reality that she would be saying goodbye to her home and relatives with the near certainty that she would never see them again. And she had a very short time to make this up, but she realized once she gets married, back then you couldn't just hop on a jet and go back home to Haran to visit the folks once in a while. It wasn't that easy. She also believed the messenger completely and was willing to make a life-changing decision just based on what he told her. Great faith. And she followed that messenger to meet her groom, who she had never met before. And she was already the bride-elect, but her actual union with Isaac would not occur until many days had passed. Now, you could make some parallels here between us as the bride of Christ, that we, in a sense, we are betrothed to Christ, and yet, as long as we're in this life, we have not yet culminated that union with our Lord. So, there's parallels here, but we believe the messenger, we believe the message that was given to us, and we follow them. And then in verse 62 through 67, we actually read about that Isaac marries Rebekah, and so she departs with the servants group. She takes along like a personal nurse, as well as some female attendants with her. And Genesis 25:20 states that Isaac was 40 years old when he got married. So he waited a little bit. He's even older than I was when I got married. And according to most calculations, this event happened about 1856 BC, which would make it about 3,881 years ago. 3,881 years ago. Isn't that something? Well, the Bible talks a lot about Abraham, and we finally get to the death of Abraham, the initial patriarch. And Abraham is probably mentioned more in the Bible, throughout the Bible, than any other Old Testament person. Maybe the exception is Moses, but I bet you Abraham is mentioned even more than him. Well, at the very beginning, we have this little insert here where it says Abraham marries Keturah. Now, Burton Kaufman and some others believe that despite where it's located in the text, that there's some evidence to suggest that actually this may have predated the death of Sarah, maybe even predated the death of Hagar. And in a way, it doesn't really change the narrative all that much. I just thought I'd bring that to your attention, that some people think there's reason to believe that. But we're told in this passage that there were 6 sons that he had with Keturah. Several of them are mentioned here, several of his descendants, his sons and grandsons. Maybe the most notable of these is his son Midian. And the reason for that is in chapter 37, it was Midianite traders that found Joseph and sold him into slavery in Egypt. In Exodus 2, Moses escapes to the land of Midian, and he marries one of the daughters of Jethro, who was the priest of Midian, and Jethro is sometimes referred to as Reuel. That happens sometimes. We see people with more than one name. In Numbers 31, the Israelites fought against the Midianites. So apparently in the intervening years, relations apparently soured between the Israelites and the Midianites, even though they were both descended from Abraham. In Judges 6 through 8, we read that Israel was continuing to have conflicts with the Midianites, and God raised up Gideon as a deliverer to fight against the Midianites. So they become, part of, kind of interwoven with the history of Israel for quite a few centuries yet. All right, so we read, beginning in verse 7, about Abraham's death and burial. He lived to be 175 years old. Now remember, we know before the flood, people lived into the 900s. Shortly after the flood, the first generations, that was cut in about half. People were living about 400 years. By the time we get to Abraham, things start becoming more normalized to what you and I are used to today. Now, Abraham and many of these other patriarchs and matriarchs lived at least into the hundreds. And then it was later that they started becoming, having lifespans that are more like what we have today. So he lived 175. He was born approximately 1996 BC, 1996. And so therefore he died in about 1821 BC. And the children of Israel left Egypt roughly 400 years later. We'll talk about that maybe whenever we study the Exodus. Well, actually, little is really known of his last 35 years of Abraham's life. We just don't know a lot about it. But anyway, after he died, Isaac and Ishmael, I'm sure there was a little, probably not the closest of relations between the two brothers, but they both loved their father, and they buried him in the cave with Sarah. At this time, Isaac would have been 75 years old, and his older brother or half-brother, Ishmael, would have been 89 years old. Now, interesting, see, you have to kind of read between the lines here and do a little bit of math, but Jacob and Esau, which we haven't talked about that yet, but they would have been roughly 15 years old at this time. So they, as teenage boys, they would have known their grandfather Abraham. They would have known him. And they probably were there to see their grandfather buried. And the residence of Isaac was at the well of Beer Lahairoi, which is the same well where Hagar had been greeted by the angel of the Lord after she was expelled from the household of Abraham. Then in verses 12 through 18, we read about the descendants of Ishmael. He had 12 sons, which became 12 princes. And then Ishmael died at 137. His younger half-brother, Isaac, would have been about 123 years old when Ishmael died. Now, in verses 19 through 34, we read about the birth of Isaac's sons. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, which is a flashback from the previous section. And for a while, Rebekah was unable to have children. And it's interesting, this is a kind of a common theme. This would be an interesting study to just look at the various times in the Old Testament where women had difficulty having birth for some reason, and then maybe what purpose that served, if any. Anyway, finally, God listened or answered the prayers the way she wanted, and she did have twins. Esau came out first, followed by Jacob. You may remember Jacob was grabbing onto his heel. And Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. So he had to wait 20 years before he finally had these two sons. In verse 27 through 34, let me just skip ahead. I thought I might have a slide. Esau sells his birthright. And anyway, so I'll just briefly say, you know, Esau, apparently he was a guy, he liked to go out and hunt. He was out, he was really hungry, and he wanted some stew or something, and apparently Isaac liked to work in the kitchen and made the stew. Anyway, long story short, unfortunately, Jacob was a bit of a trickster, and he managed to talk Esau out of his birthright. Apparently, he didn't really value it, and apparently Esau was the kind of person that was kind of really sought immediate gratification, kind of just whatever pleased you right now, didn't really think about the long-term consequences. And the writer of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews makes reference to this in chapter 12, verses 16 and 17. He says that Esau was a godless person. Now, it doesn't say that in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament is really the New Testament revealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament concealed. And so we find out a little bit information that we didn't have before. So we're told that he was a godless person who sold his own birthright for a single meal. Even afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears. So that's one thing, and then later we'll see that Jacob pulled another fast one on his brother, it's very sad for Esau. All right, now we're moving on to chapter 26, where Isaac, I believe there's a famine in the land, and anyway, Isaac decides he's going to move over to the city of Gerar, which at that time was controlled by the Philistines. I almost said the Philippines. The Philistines, which in a way has some similarities to his father Abraham, because his father Abraham also, for a while, dwelt in the area around Gerar, and he had relations with the king Abimelech. Now, Abimelech is also mentioned here, and let me just make sure I'm in the right chapter. Yes. Now, he had some kind of relations with Abimelech, somewhat friendly, but he did kind of the same thing here. He was kind of followed the same modus operandi as father. Apparently, Rebekah was attractive, and he thought, well, maybe if they think that Rebekah's his wife, they might kill him so they can have her. So he just said, oh, no, she's just my sister. So he did the same kind of thing, same deception. Now, this may not necessarily be the same Abimelech that Abraham dealt with. It could be his son. Also, I mentioned that Abimelech may have been just a general term for the ruler. Just like when the Bible talks about Pharaoh, that wasn't somebody's first name, that was the ruler. Or just like the Germans would say, the Kaiser. Well, Abimelech may have been just what they called the ruler, so it may not be a proper name. All right, so anyway, the Lord appears to Isaac, and one thing, it's interesting that over and over again, we see God appearing to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and later to Jacob, continually reassuring them that I haven't forgotten about you, the promise still stands, because remember, they had to wait a long time. In fact, in their lifetime, they never saw the fulfillment of their promise. And so God is just reassuring them, don't worry, I know what I'm doing. This land will be your land. Your descendants will be a great nation. He just keeps repeating this. So anyway, just like Abraham, Isaac lied about his wife Rebekah, but then we read that God prospered Isaac, and the Philistines envied him, and they envied him, and they plugged up his wells. So there was quarreling about the wells. And eventually they told him to go away because he was getting too prosperous. And so in verses 18 through 25, we read about the dispute over the wells. And it seemed like every time they dug a well, they were pushed out. And they dug a third well that they were allowed to keep. In verse 28, Abimelech says, we have plainly seen that the Lord has been with you. And in verse 29, you are now blessed of the Lord. So even the Philistines, they recognize there's something about Isaac and his family that God is favoring these people. God is blessing this people. And so they make a covenant with Isaac. And then lastly, just kind of at the tail end, the last 2 verses of this chapter, we read that when Esau was 40 years old, he married 2 Hittite women. And we read that they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. And this is not the first time we read that. There's a couple more references in future chapters where it mentions how miserable they are with these 2 daughters-in-law. And you can only imagine, I don't know what they were so difficult. I don't know if it was their religious practices or what they ate or how they dressed or whatever, but they were apparently very difficult. And later on, there's a statement that Rebekah says, basically, like, I just can't live anymore with these 2 girls. I just, it's like my life, I just want to end it or whatever. It's just miserable with these 2 daughters-in-law of mine. And anyway, it closes out there. And now that gets us to chapter 27, Jacob's deception. So he already tricked Esau out of birthright, but he's not done yet. Let me just see here if I have. Okay, yeah. Verse 29, okay. So Isaac asks Esau to go hunt game for him. Apparently Isaac kind of favored Esau, and he really liked that wild game. So Esau goes and hunt, and really, it's really Rebekah that's really kind of the mastermind behind all of this. In a way, Jacob just kind of goes along with it, but it's really Rebekah. She overhears Isaac. She hatches a plan for Jacob to receive his father's blessing instead of Esau. So she's tricking out her one son over the other son. She's showing favoritism here. And she's cooking a meal, trying to disguise it. She gets 2 goats and tries to disguise it like wild game, just the way that she knows that Isaac likes it. She's dressing up Jacob so that he looks and smells and feels like Esau. So she's really the one who's, making this all up, and then Jacob just has to carry it out. So in verses 18 through 29, Jacob impersonates Esau, and he brings him his father his favorite meal, and then he receives the blessing that was intended for Esau. And then in verses 30 through 38, Esau returned from hunting and discovers that he's been shortchanged by his brother. And of course, he's extremely upset. And even Isaac seems upset because it says he's shaking when he suspects that he's been tricked. And I feel sorry for Esau. He's upset, he's weeping, and he's begging, he's pleading, do you have any kind of a blessing left over for me? Is there something you can give to me? And Jacob just essentially says, there's not much that I can give to you, which is interesting because, ultimately it's God that does the blessing. So it's a little hard to explain why Isaac blessing his sons, why it carries so much power. But maybe God revealed that to him or gave him that authority. I'm not really sure. But apparently, Jacob got the blessing that should have gone to Esau. And that was foretold a long time ago, that Jacob would supplant his older brother. Well, Esau was fuming. He was so upset, so angry, that he even plans to kill Jacob. He's just biding his time until his father Isaac passes away. He says, he must have told somebody that, well, when my father goes, I'm going to kill my brother Jacob for what he did. And of course, Rebekah, she must have spies everywhere because she overheard Isaac, and now she's overhearing what Esau's plan is to kill. So she quickly talks to Jacob and tells him, go flee to Haran and stay with his uncle Laban, which is her brother. Stay with him a few days until Esau cools off. Maybe after a few days, weeks maybe go by, he'll cool off and he won't kill you. I mean, it's pretty serious when one brother wants to kill another brother. And then in verse 46, Rebekah's complaining again in 27 about those daughters-in-law. She says to Isaac, I am tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. Daughters of Heth, those are Hittites who Mostly they had an empire in what is now Turkey, but they also had some colonies apparently down in Palestine area. So I'm tired because of those daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth, like these from the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? So she's telling her husband, please, don't get one of these either Canaanite or Hittite women. And so it kind of makes sense then. We don't know how much time has gone by exactly because Isaac goes and tells Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman. He sends him to Paddan Aram, a region in northern Mesopotamia where the city of Haran was, to the home of his uncle Laban. I have the map there. There we go. Map, so you can see, I believe they were living in Beersheba, and Haran is way up there. Now, Abraham and his family originally came from Ur, which is in southern Mesopotamia, kind of near the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates, near the Persian Gulf there. They migrate as far as Haran, and then his father stopped and go beyond that. But anyway, so they have a lot of relatives up there in Haran. And so the journey from Beersheba to Haran was about 500 miles to the northeast. And in verse 6 through 9, Esau noticed that his parents were really upset about his wives, but they wanted Jacob to marry people who came from a God-fearing family and from the relatives. And maybe he noted that. Maybe he thought, well, perhaps I can. It doesn't really say, but it says that he noticed that. And it says Esau married a third wife, the daughter of Isaac's older brother Ishmael, his uncle, so that, in other words, he married a woman who ultimately was his cousin. And maybe he did that, perhaps he thought, well, maybe his parents would be more pleased with that. He already had 2 wives, now he's got 3. So he's practicing polygamy. I'm not sure if they were really in favor of that. But maybe he thought, well, at least if I get somebody descended from Abraham, maybe they'll be better with that. So Jacob is sent away. Well, on the way, he stops at a place that became known as Bethel, which means house of God. And of course, this is Jacob's famous dream, what Led Zeppelin called the stairway to heaven. But actually in verse 12, we read it was a ladder with angels ascending and descending on it. And the Hebrew word here literally is ladder. It's not stairway or staircase. And what's interesting, this is the only use of this word in the entire Old Testament. This Hebrew word for ladder is not used anywhere else in the Hebrew. Now, they had a word for stairs, but it's not used here. So anyway, some people, well, I won't get into it. There's a reason why some people want to make it stairs, but it's not really important here. And then Jesus even referred to this event. So it's just really neat. As we look through Genesis, the very first day of class, I was telling you that Genesis is such a big part of the New Testament that if you cut out all the references to Genesis that you find in the New Testament, you'd have so much less material in the New Testament because there's so many references to things. And even Jesus verifies the truthfulness of this event. Jesus referenced this event when he said to Nathanael early in his ministry, "You will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And this is in John 1:51. Well, what's the meaning of the ladder? I think maybe there's three items of significance. One is the ladder indicates God's continual interest of human affairs. You see that there is a line of communication between heaven and earth. There is a connection. And you see myriads of angels that are busy going up and down the ladder between heaven and earth. Hebrews says that these angels are ministering spirits sent out to provide service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. Hebrews 1:14. Number 2, so that's the connection between God and man, that God is interested. Number 2, the omnipresence of God. God is everywhere. Jacob was far from home, he was in a strange land, and he was in an isolated place. And he's probably fearful. He was basically fleeing for his life, going to a place he had never been to before. He just knew some relatives were there, and really not knowing what the future held for him. But this dream with the ladder reassures him that he was continually under the watchful eye of God Almighty. And after he woke up, Jacob remarked, "The Lord is certainly in this place," verse 16. In other words, he's everywhere. He's even here. And probably was comforting to know that no matter where I go, I know that God is with me, God is watching over me. Finally, the ladder is a type of Jesus Christ, the mediator between God and sinful mankind. The ladder represents the connection and the way between the two. Christ affirmed that he is the way and the life and the truth. Jesus said as much to Nathanael in the quote that I already said about angels descending on him, heaven opened up, so that God, in a sense, God is like the ladder. God is the bridge between us. There's a great chasm between us and God. Jesus is the bridge. He's the connection. He's the ladder by which, he came down to us, and now we can go up and be with him. And in verse 19, the place that he was in originally was called Luz, but Jacob renames it Bethel, house of God. And there's a map. I know it's probably a little bit small for you to read, but this is probably the likely route that Jacob took. Well, now we have another dating situation. It's just kind of interesting to see how these people met and married. Jacob meets Rachel by the well, which, by the way, this kind of makes me think of something. It would be an interesting study to look in the Old Testament at wells. Wells are like focal points. They're points where people gather, because in an arid land, it kind of makes sense that people came from all around to focus on the well. And a lot of things happen at wells. There's a lot of significant events in the Bible that happen around wells. I just think that would be an interesting Bible study or an interesting sermon just to look at that someday. So Jacob arrives in Haran, finally makes it there, and he stops at a well and talks with some shepherds. And then Rachel arrives with her father's sheep, and Jacob greeted her with a quick kiss and wept for joy. Jacob goes to her home, and he offers to work 7 years to marry Rachel, who's Leah's younger sister. And verse 20, this is a beautiful statement. It says, Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him like only a few days because of his love for her. And I wonder, men, how many of you would be willing to work 7 years just to get the wife you have now? Isn't that romantic? And also we know what was to have been a visit for a few days ends up being many years. Originally he was supposed to go there for a few days, right? Until his brother cools off. Well, we know that not only does he stay for 7 years, but then he stays another 7 years and beyond that. And then we read about Laban's treachery. Okay, we already have this. Sorry. They met. Okay, Laban's treachery. Leah, instead of Rachel, turns out on the wedding night, and then she has a slave named Zilpah. And then later, he does get Rachel after a week, but then he has to work another 7 years for him. So what was supposed to be a few weeks turns out to about 14 years. And Rachel has a slave, Bilhah. And then Leah has 4 sons. These are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Now, Rachel is the one that Jacob really loves the most. But maybe because Leah is sort of being pushed aside or held in less honor, that's why God chooses to bless her and gives her 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. All right. Well, anyway, that's a quick run through 29. Next week, we're going to be looking at the sons of Jacob. I could maybe be about a minute or so. I could at least give you a head start on that. There they are. That's exactly what they look like. We know this from rock etching. No, not really. Well, we read that Rachel was jealous of Leah, understandably. So she gives him her slave Bilhah, kind of like what Sarah did with Hagar, right? Says it was like a surrogate daughter. They didn't have the sperm bank and all that back then. So this is kind of the other way around that. So she gives her Bilhah, and Bilhah has Dan, which is the 5th son of Jacob. But anyway, you'll see Rachel has to wait quite a while before she finally has a son. All right? So anyway, that's a little bit. Finally, I finally got up to where I wanted to be today. So we're going to try to do about 7 chapters a week. And I think we've got 3 more weeks left in the Genesis class. So thank you so much for attending, and I will see you next Sunday.